Spend a winter in Tibet and discover how families survived at 4,000 meters. Travel Sleep Stories. Hi everyone. Tonight we're swapping central heating for a stove that runs on dried yak dung, swapping a full tank of oxygen for roughly 60% of what your lungs are used to, and swapping your duvet for approximately 9 layers of wool you will not be removing until spring. Welcome to a winter on the Tibetan Plateau, 4,000 meters up, where the sky is so close you could apparently reach up and dust it, and where an entire family, several yaks, and a very judgmental dog are about to share one small room for the next 6 months. If that sounds like a lot, it is. If it sounds cozy, you have no idea yet. Before we get going, if this is the sort of oddly specific bedtime education you're into, a like and a subscribe genuinely helps this little channel keep finding its way to more sleepy travelers, though only if you're actually enjoying the trip. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there, because there's something comforting about knowing someone's hearing this over breakfast, while someone else is hearing it wide awake at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling. And if your ears would rather do this without your eyes involved at all, the show now lives on Spotify too, so you can take the whole journey with you, tuck the phone away, and just listen. Now go ahead, dim things down, get however cozy your version of cozy looks like tonight, and let's slip into some very thin, very cold air together. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually feels like to get winded climbing a single flight of stairs, in your own home, doing nothing wrong? Could you drink a cup of tea made from salt, butter, and a brick of fermented leaves and pretend to enjoy it in front of your host? Would you know how to read an entire winter's worth of danger into the colour of the sky over a mountain pass? Could you survive a season where your main form of central heating is something an animal produced yesterday, and you had to go collect it yourself? And could you fall asleep at night with your whole extended family, 2 goats and a yak calf all breathing in the same small room, and somehow find that comforting instead of horrifying? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up on the Tibetan Plateau in the early 1900s in a stone house with no chimney, thin air, and a mother already awake and building a fire out of things you'd rather not think too hard about. Welcome to winter at the roof of the world. Try to breathe slowly. The first thing you notice is not the cold, it's the silence, thick and complete, the kind that only exists at altitude, where there isn't enough air left over to carry much sound. You surface slowly from sleep under a mountain of yak wool blankets, and for a moment you don't move at all, because moving means leaving the one warm pocket of the universe you've managed to build for yourself overnight. Somewhere near your feet, someone's grandmother is already awake and quietly cursing at a stubborn ember. The single window, if the house has one, is a small square of pale grey light, frost feathered across the inside of the glass in patterns no artist could plan. You are 4,000 meters above sea level, and your body, still catching up, has not yet agreed to any of this. You sit up eventually, because someone has to, and the cold air outside your blanket cocoon hits your face like a decision you didn't make. Your breath fogs in front of you indoors, which is a sentence that should not make sense, and does. The floor is packed earth, cold enough that you instinctively curl your toes the moment they touch it. And somewhere above your head, smoke from last night's dying fire still hangs in a thin grey layer. Because heat rises, and so, apparently, does everything else in this house. There is no getting up quietly here. Every movement announces itself. A rustle of wool, a creak of floorboard, the clink of a metal bowl being set down with the particular carefulness of someone who does not want to be the one who wakes the baby. Breakfast, if you can call it that, begins before the sun has fully committed to the day. It's less a meal and more a ritual of reassembly. Everyone slowly reconstituting themselves out of layers of wool and sleep, gathering near the stove the way people back home gather near a coffee machine. Except here, the coffee machine also happens to be the only source of heat in the building, and everyone's life depends on its staying lit. Ever tried getting out of bed on the coldest morning of the year? The one where your apartment's heating clearly gave up sometime around 3 a.m. Now, imagine that every single morning for 6 months straight, with no thermostat to blame and no landlord to call. What's remarkable, though, is how quickly the household finds its rhythm despite all of it. Within minutes, the fire is coaxed back to a proper glow. Water is set to warm, and the previous night's cold, silent house has transformed into something almost lively. Voices low but steady, the scrape of a ladle, a child being bundled into an extra layer whether they want it or not. Nobody complains about the cold out loud, mostly because complaining about the cold here would be a bit like complaining about the ocean being wet. It's simply the base condition of existence, the water everyone is swimming in, and the only sensible response is to get dressed, get moving, and get on with the extraordinary, unglamorous business of surviving another day at the top of the world. The bell that ends this particular morning is not a bell at all. It's the smell of tea. Let's talk about the air, because it is technically there and technically not helping. At this altitude, every breath delivers noticeably less oxygen than the one you took at sea level. And your lungs, entirely unconsulted on the matter, have to work harder for the same result. Simple tasks, carrying water, climbing to the upper floor, chasing down a wandering goat, leave you a little breathless in a way that feels suspiciously like being unfit. Except everyone around you seems to be handling it fine. Newcomers get headaches, dizziness, a strange fatigue that no amount of sleep quite fixes. The locals, whose bodies have adapted over generations, watch you gasp your way up a gentle hill with the patient, faintly amused expression of people who have seen this exact scene many times before. This isn't just toughness either, though there's plenty of that going around. Communities that have lived at extreme altitude for many generations show real, measurable physical adaptations. From higher rates of oxygen delivery in the blood to lung capacities that would make a sea-level athlete quietly reconsider their life choices. A local herder can jog up a slope that leaves you doubled over with your hands on your knees, and they'll barely break stride, because their body has spent generations quietly optimizing for exactly this problem, while yours was busy optimizing for escalators and elevators. You, meanwhile, are stuck relearning the most basic mechanics of your own body. Walking becomes a slower, more deliberate act. You pause more than you'd like to admit, catching your breath while pretending to admire the view, which, to be fair, is genuinely spectacular, so at least your cover story has some integrity to it. Ever tried explaining to a co-worker that you need a break, not because the task is hard, but because the air itself simply isn't holding up its end of the bargain? That's every hour of every day up here, except instead of a co-worker, it's a 14-year-old effortlessly herding 3 yaks past you while you're still catching your breath from standing up. The cold makes it worse, tightening your chest, turning each inhale into something sharper than it should be. You learn quickly not to rush anything, not because you're lazy, but because rushing at this altitude has consequences that a flat, oxygen-rich hometown never warned you about. Locals move with an economy of motion that looks almost lazy, until you realize it's actually the most efficient possible way to conserve a resource you can no longer take for granted. Every step is paid for here, quite literally, in oxygen, and the wisest people in the room are the ones who've stopped spending it carelessly. You, red-faced and wheezing behind a woman carrying a jug of water on her back like it weighs nothing at all, are clearly still working on that particular lesson. It's time to talk about the single most important object in the house, and it is not glamorous. At this altitude, trees are a rumour, so firewood simply isn't an option for most families, which means the household stove runs almost entirely on dried yak dung, collected, shaped, and stacked with the same care your grandmother once gave her good china. It burns hot, clean once it's fully dried, and gives off a faint, earthy smell that every child raised here will recognise, decades later, as the smell of being safe and warm. The stove sits at the centre of the room both literally and socially, the one spot everyone gravitates toward, the kitchen, the heater, and the unofficial family meeting point rolled into a single, smouldering box. The stove itself is usually a simple structure of clay, mud brick, or stacked stone, built low and solid, with an opening for fuel and a flat top or hanging hook for cooking pots. It isn't fussy, and it doesn't need to be, because everything about it has been refined over centuries of people figuring out exactly how to squeeze the maximum amount of warmth out of the most available fuel source on an otherwise treeless plateau. Ever tried explaining to someone from a temperate climate that your home heating system runs entirely on a renewable resource produced daily by your own livestock? It sounds like a punchline. It is, in fact, extremely sound logistics. Tending it properly is a genuine skill, one passed down the way other families might pass down a recipe. Too little fuel, and the room turns cold within the hour. Too much, packed in carelessly, and you get more smoke than heat, curling up toward the ceiling and out through whatever gap has been left for exactly that purpose. Children are taught early how to feed the fire, how to arrange the dung patties so air can move through properly, how to read the flame the way someone elsewhere might read a stovetop dial. It becomes second nature quickly, mostly because the alternative to getting it right is a very cold night, and nobody here needs that lesson twice. There's a quiet dignity to the whole system that's easy to miss if you're too busy being squeamish about the source material. Nothing here is wasted. The animal that gives milk, wool and labour also, indirectly, gives heat, closing a loop that a lot of modern households would frankly struggle to match with all their thermostats and gas lines combined. You watch the fire glow steady and orange against the dim room, the smell settling into your clothes whether you like it or not, and you come to a grudging, slightly smoky appreciation for a heating system that has kept entire families alive through winters that would flatten most modern infrastructure within a week. Now for the drink that will either become your new obsession or the reason you develop a sudden, urgent need to check something outside. Butter tea, po cha, is made by churning strong black tea with yak butter and a pinch of salt until it turns thick, pale, and faintly savoury. Poured into your bowl the moment it's empty, again and again, whether you asked for a refill or not. It is not tea the way you know tea. It is closer to a warm, salty, fat-rich soup that happens to be liquid enough to sip. And it is, quite genuinely, one of the smartest inventions on the entire plateau. Because at this altitude and cold, your body is desperately craving exactly what's in that bowl. The churning itself is a small performance. Tea and butter and salt poured into a tall wooden cylinder called a chandong, then plunged and worked with a long wooden dasher until everything emulsifies into something thick enough to coat a spoon. It's a physical task, arms working steadily, the sound a rhythmic, sloshing thud that becomes as familiar a part of the household soundtrack as the crackle of the stove itself. In many homes, this job falls to whoever's turn it is that morning, and there is, you'll notice, a very particular technique to it, the kind that looks effortless in the hands of someone who's done it 10,000 times, and looks like a small domestic crisis in yours. Refusing a bowl outright is considered impolite. So the accepted strategy, once you've had your fill, is to simply leave your bowl mostly full and untouched. A subtle signal that you're finished, since an empty bowl is treated as an open invitation for more. It's a bit like the modern art of nursing a single drink at a party, so nobody keeps topping you up. Except here, the stakes are slightly higher, because saying no directly can come across as an actual social misstep, rather than a mild inconvenience to your host. The taste itself takes most newcomers by surprise. It isn't sweet, isn't really tea in the way you'd expect, and lands somewhere between a savoury broth and a very rich, salty butter melted into hot water. Give it a few days, though, and something shifts. Your body, working overtime in the cold and thin air, starts craving exactly the fat and salt it delivers. And what tasted strange on day 1 starts tasting by day 4 like precisely what you needed all along. Ever had a food you were sure you'd hate turn into the thing you quietly start looking forward to? That's butter tea. And by the time you leave, you may find yourself missing it more than you'd ever admit out loud. Let's talk about the food that shows up at nearly every meal in nearly every form, whether you're ready for it or not. Tsampa, roasted barley ground into a fine flour, is mixed directly into your bowl of butter tea and kneaded with your fingers into a thick, doughy paste you eat right out of your own hand. It travels well, keeps for months, needs no cooking once it's roasted, and delivers enough calories to fuel a full day of hauling water and chasing livestock through snow. It is, essentially, the emergency granola bar of an entire civilization. Except this particular granola bar has been keeping people alive at 4,000 meters for well over 1,000 years. The process of making it starts long before it ever reaches your bowl. Barley is roasted first, a step that toasts the grain into something fragrant and faintly nutty. Then ground down between stones into a fine, pale flour that keeps for months without spoiling. A genuinely useful trait when your nearest grain market might be a multi-day walk away. Once it's in your bowl alongside your tea, the actual technique of eating it takes a bit of practice. You work the flour and liquid together with your fingers, pressing and folding inside the bowl itself, until it forms a dense, workable dough you can pinch off in small bites. Your first attempt will almost certainly end in a small barley flour avalanche across your lap. Everyone's does. What makes tsampa such a quietly brilliant piece of food technology is how completely it's adapted to its environment. It requires no fire to prepare on the spot, which matters enormously to herders out with the animals for days at a time, far from any stove. It's light to carry, dense in calories, and endlessly customizable, sweetened with a bit of sugar for children, mixed with cheese or dried meat for a heartier meal, or eaten completely plain when you're simply trying to get through the afternoon. Ever try to imagine a single food that works as breakfast, hiking snack, and emergency ration all at once? Tsampa has been doing exactly that since long before the phrase meal replacement existed anywhere at all. There's also something almost meditative about the eating of it, once you get the hang of it. The kneading, the pinching, the slow, deliberate bites. It forces a kind of unhurried pace that fits neatly into a life already governed by slowness, patience, and conserving your energy. You watch an elderly woman work her bowl into a neat, tidy ball in the time it takes you to make a genuine mess of yours, and you begin to suspect, correctly, that there's an entire lifetime of practice behind that particular skill. By the time you finally get it right, you'll have earned it the same way everyone here did. One lopsided, barley-dusted attempt at a time. Let's get you dressed, because stepping outside in anything less than full armour here is not bravery. It's a mistake you make exactly once. You start with wool against the skin, add a thick sheepskin robe called a tuba, wrapped and belted at the waist, so it can double as storage for anything from a bowl to a baby, and finish with boots lined in felt and fur that make you walk like you've just learned to use your legs for the first time. One sleeve of the tuba is often left hanging loose, freeing an arm for work the moment the sun gets generous enough to allow it. By the time you're fully dressed, you've roughly doubled in size, and you will not be taking any of it off again until spring makes a formal, convincing case for itself. The tuba itself deserves a moment of real appreciation because it is, quietly, one of the most practical garments ever devised for a climate this extreme. Loose enough to trap a layer of warm air against your body, heavy enough to block wind that would cut straight through anything thinner, and versatile enough to be cinched tighter in a blizzard or loosened during a rare burst of midday sun, it functions less like a single outfit and more like a wearable climate control system. The wide belt at the waist creates a kind of built-in pocket called the toe, where you can tuck a bowl, some sampa, a small tool, or, as new mothers quickly discover, an infant who needs to stay warm while both your hands remain free for work. Ever tried carrying groceries, a phone, and a toddler at once with no bag? This solved that problem several centuries ago. Layering underneath is its own art form. Wool against the skin first, for warmth, and to wick away sweat before it can freeze against you. Then additional layers depending on the day's work and the day's weather, which here can shift dramatically within a single afternoon. Boots are stuffed with dried grass or extra wool for insulation, and mittens, when the cold turns serious, are less an accessory and more a requirement for keeping your fingers attached to your hands in any functional sense. What strikes you most, though, is how much personality survives inside all that practical bulk. Jewellery, colourful sashes, and finely embroidered trim turn even the most utilitarian winter outfit into something with real character. A quiet insistence that survival and beauty don't have to be mutually exclusive. Wealthier families display this more elaborately, with turquoise, coral and silver worked into headpieces and belts, while everyday winter wear leans practical first, decorative second. Either way, by the time you step outside fully bundled, moving with the stiff, waddling gait of someone wearing roughly 9 layers of wool, you understand something essential about winter here. Nobody is dressing for the weather they wish they had.
Everyone is dressing, quite seriously, for the weather that is actually trying to kill them. It's time to talk about one of the least glamorous chores of the day, and someone has to do it. The nearest stream or spring has, overnight, transformed itself into a solid sheet of ice, which means fetching water starts with a heavy stick, a lot of determined chopping, and the quiet hope that today isn't the day you slip and become one with the frozen ground. Once you've broken through, the water gets hauled home in a wooden or metal container strapped to your back, sloshing cold down your spine with every uneven step. It is, without question, an upper body workout no gym membership could replicate, and you'll be doing it again tomorrow and the day after that for the rest of the season. The chopping itself takes real technique, not just brute force. Strike in the wrong spot, and you'll spend 20 minutes hacking at ice that barely dents. Strike correctly, at a weak point near the edge where the current still moves beneath the surface, and it gives way cleanly, revealing dark, startlingly cold water that immediately numbs your fingers the moment they get anywhere near it. Children are taught this skill early, not because anyone enjoys assigning it to them, but because water doesn't fetch itself, and every able body in the household is expected to contribute to the daily task of simply staying hydrated in a place actively working against that goal. The walk home is its own particular misery. The container, whether a traditional wooden bucket or a repurposed metal drum, rides on your back, held by a strap across your forehead or shoulders, and every uneven patch of frozen ground threatens to send both you and a significant portion of your hard-won water sprawling across the path. Ever tried carrying a full cup of coffee across a room without spilling a drop? Except the room is an icy mountainside, and the coffee weighs considerably more, and occasionally comes with a wind chill that makes your ears hurt. That's roughly the daily experience, minus the coffee, plus considerably higher stakes. What makes it bearable, oddly, is the same thing that makes most hard labour here bearable. It's shared, it's routine, and it's rarely done in true silence. Trips to the water source often happen in small groups, Neighbours timing their chores together, trading news and complaints about the cold while they work, turning an objectively miserable task into a genuine, if chilly, social occasion. By the time you're back inside, hands aching, shoulders sore, water finally set near the stove to gradually lose its most punishing edge of cold, you've earned every single sip of the tea that follows, and you understand, with newfound clarity, exactly why nobody here takes running water for granted, because out here, quite literally, nothing runs. You have to go get it yourself, one frozen bucket at a time. For the herding families who don't live in fixed village homes, winter means a very particular kind of shelter. The bar, a tent woven from thick strands of yak hair, black and dense enough to shrug off wind that would flatten anything lighter. From the outside, it looks almost unassuming, a low, dark shape against a white landscape. Inside, it's warmer than you'd expect, smoky, cluttered, and organised according to rules that make perfect sense to the family living there, and none whatsoever to you. The hearth sits in the middle, smoke curling up and out through a gap left deliberately open at the top, because in a tent with no chimney, the roof itself has to know how to breathe. The material itself is worth pausing on, because yak hair, coarse and naturally water-resistant, makes for a surprisingly effective building material once it's spun, woven, and stitched into long panels that get sewn together into the finished tent. It sheds snow, blocks wind, and, crucially, absorbs and holds heat from the fire far better than you'd expect from something that started life attached to an animal grazing outside in the cold. Ever tried to imagine your winter coat also functioning as your entire house? That's essentially the logic here, scaled up and staked into the ground. Inside, the layout follows an unspoken but consistent order. One side is typically reserved for cooking and household goods, the other for sleeping and storage, with the space around the central hearth serving as the shared gathering point for eating, talking, and warming frozen hands after a day spent out with the herd. Rugs and hides cover the ground, softening what would otherwise be a very cold, very hard floor, and every available surface tends to be pressed into some practical use, because space, much like oxygen, is a resource you learn not to waste. Setting up and taking down a bar is a skill in itself, one every member of a nomadic household learns from childhood, since these tents move with the herds according to season, following grazing patterns that have been refined over countless generations. It comes down efficiently, packs onto the backs of yaks alongside everything else the family owns, and goes back up again at the next camp with a speed that would put most modern camping trips to shame. You watch a family dismantle, transport, and fully reassemble their entire home in the time it takes you to figure out which end of a tent pole goes where, and you're reminded, gently but firmly, that what looks like simple rural life is, in fact, a highly refined logistical operation that's been quietly perfected over roughly 1,000 years. Let's talk about sleeping arrangements, because privacy, as a concept, is largely sitting this winter out. Grandparents, parents, children, and the occasional newborn animal too fragile to survive the cold outdoors often share a single main room, everyone bundled together under layers of wool and hide, which sounds cramped, and is, in fact, cramped, but also happens to be an excellent heating strategy. Body warmth adds up fast in an enclosed space, and a house full of breathing, shifting, occasionally snoring relatives turns out to be a remarkably effective substitute for insulation you can't otherwise afford. You learn, quickly, that 4,000 meters up, closeness isn't a lifestyle choice. It's a survival strategy that just happens to also involve your uncle's snoring. The sleeping arrangement itself tends to follow a rough, understood hierarchy. Elders often given the warmest spot nearest the stove, younger children tucked in wherever they'll do the least kicking, and everyone else arranged according to some combination of habit, seniority, and whoever got there first. Bedding is simple but effective. Thick wool blankets, sheepskins and hides layered over a raised platform or simply spread across the floor. Everything designed to trap as much warmth as possible against a floor that never fully loses its chill. Ever tried sharing a hotel room with extended family on a holiday trip and silently counted the days until you got your own space back? Now imagine that arrangement, minus the option of ever getting your own space back, for roughly 6 months straight. There's a practical genius to it that becomes obvious the longer you stay. A single body loses heat quickly in a cold room. Multiple bodies, clustered together under shared blankets, lose it far more slowly. Each person effectively acting as a small, breathing radiator for everyone nearby. Newborn lambs or goat kids too weak to handle the outdoor cold are sometimes brought inside as well, tucked near the fire or even into a corner of the sleeping area, blurring the line between livestock and family in a way that would raise eyebrows elsewhere and barely gets a second glance here.
What surprises most outsiders isn't the lack of privacy itself, but how little it seems to bother anyone actually living it. Conversations happen in low murmurs after the fire's been banked for the night, punctuated by shifting blankets and the occasional cough. And somewhere in that shared, crowded darkness, a strange kind of comfort takes hold. The reassurance of never actually being alone with the cold. By the time you've spent a full week sleeping shoulder to shoulder with people you'd never met a month ago, you find yourself, somewhat to your own surprise, sleeping better than you have in years. Proof that sometimes the coziest solution to a hard problem is simply more people. Let's talk about the animal that makes literally all of this possible. Because without the yak, this entire way of life simply doesn't exist. The yak provides milk, butter, cheese, meat, wool for tents and clothing, dung for fuel, leather for boots, and, when needed, its own back for hauling loads across terrain that would break most other animals entirely. It is built for this cold, covered in a dense double coat, comfortable at altitudes that leave humans wheezing on a gentle incline. Families don't simply own yaks the way you might own livestock back home. They organise entire winters around them and treat a healthy herd with the kind of quiet, practical devotion you'd normally reserve for a retirement account. Physically, the yak is almost comically well suited to its environment, with a heart and lungs proportionally larger than lowland cattle,
blood adapted to carry oxygen efficiently in thin air, and a shaggy, layered coat that can shrug off temperatures that would be genuinely dangerous to most other domesticated animals. Watching one plough steadily through snow that would leave a horse floundering, or graze calmly on a wind-scoured slope where nothing else seems to want to survive, gives you a real appreciation for just how specifically evolution tailored this particular animal for this particular corner of the planet. Ever try to imagine an animal that's essentially a walking, breathing, all-terrain vehicle, dairy farm, and heating fuel factory rolled into one? Congratulations, you're looking right at it. The relationship between families and their herds goes well beyond simple ownership. A family's wealth and standing are often measured directly in the size and health of their yak herd, and decisions about migration, grazing, and even marriage can be shaped by herd size and condition. Individual animals are frequently known by name, temperament, and history, the way you might know a particularly reliable old car, except this particular vehicle also produces milk, grows its own replacement parts, and occasionally headbutts you if you get too close during a bad mood. Their milk, thick and rich, becomes butter, cheese, and yogurt through processes refined over generations, each product designed to store well through a long winter with no refrigeration beyond the naturally freezing air outside. Their wool gets spun into the very tents and ropes that shelter and secure the household. Even after death, a yak continues providing, its hide becoming leather, its bones and horns repurposed into tools. Very little goes to waste, a practical necessity in a place where nothing extra is easy to come by. By the time you've spent a winter here, you understand completely why a good yak is treated less like property and more like a genuinely essential, if occasionally grumpy, member of the household. It's time to talk about one of the year's biggest logistical operations, moving the entire herd down to lower, more sheltered winter grazing ground before the high pastures disappear under snow entirely. This means days of walking, families and animals together, picking a careful route across terrain that shifts from grassland to rock to ice, with very little warning. Every yak, sheep, and goat has to be accounted for, because a single animal lost to a ravine or a sudden storm is a real and serious loss, not a minor inconvenience. It is, essentially, the world's highest altitude, highest stakes commute. And there is no snow day option, no matter how badly your legs are begging for one. The timing of this migration is a skill honed over generations. Families reading subtle shifts in temperature, wind, and the behavior of the animals themselves to judge exactly when the high pastures have given all they're going to give for the season. Wait too long, and an early storm can trap the herd in terrain that becomes genuinely lethal within hours. Move too early, and you waste grazing time the animals genuinely need before the harder months set in. There's no app for this, no forecast pulled up on a phone. There's only decades of accumulated, hard-won knowledge, passed down from parent to child, the way other cultures might pass down a family business. The journey itself is grueling in a way that's difficult to overstate. Entire households pack up everything they own, tents, cooking equipment, bedding, provisions, and load it onto the very animals they're herding, forming a slow-moving caravan across landscapes with no roads, no signage, and frequently no clear path at all, beyond the one etched into the collective memory of whoever's leading the way. Ever tried moving apartments during a single stressful weekend and sworn you'd never do it again? Now imagine doing that same move, on foot, across a mountain, with livestock, every single year, without fail, for your entire life. Children walk alongside adults, learning the route and the rhythm of the migration as naturally as they learn to speak, while dogs, bred and trained specifically for this work, range around the herd's edges, nudging stragglers back into line with an efficiency that would put most professional sheepdogs to shame. Nights along the way are spent in makeshift camps, tents pitched quickly against the falling temperature, fires built from whatever fuel was carried along or gathered en route. By the time the family finally reaches lower, more sheltered ground, exhausted, wind-burned, and thoroughly done with walking for a while, there's a genuine, well-earned sense of relief in the air. The kind that comes only after successfully completing a task where failure was never really an option worth entertaining. For families who don't live in tents, home means a squat, thick-walled house built from packed earth or stone, with tiny windows and walls sometimes several feet deep, designed less like a cozy cottage and more like a small, determined fortress against the wind. The ground floor often houses the animals, whose body heat conveniently rises to warm the family's living quarters above, an arrangement that is equal parts practical engineering and mildly unfortunate for anyone's sense of smell. Flat roofs double as storage and workspace whenever the weather allows it. From a distance, an entire village can look like it grew directly out of the mountainside, which, structurally speaking, it more or less did. The walls themselves are a genuine feat of low-tech engineering, thick enough that indoor temperatures stay noticeably more stable than the brutal swings happening just outside, acting as a kind of thermal mass that slowly absorbs heat during the day and releases it gradually through the coldest hours of the night. Small windows, sometimes covered with little more than a stretched hide or wooden shutter rather than glass, keep heat loss to a minimum, which also means the inside of most homes stays fairly dim, lit mostly by the glow of the stove and whatever daylight manages to squeeze through the doorway. Ever tried living somewhere with genuinely excellent insulation, but genuinely terrible natural lighting? That's basically the trade-off every household here has quietly agreed to. Housing animals on the ground floor isn't just about convenience either, though the convenience matters a great deal when your alternative is trekking out into a blizzard to check on livestock. The heat they generate, simply by existing, measurably warms the floor above, turning every household's yaks, sheep and goats into a kind of ambient, if occasionally noisy and pungent, heating system. You get used to the smell faster than you'd expect, mostly because the alternative, freezing, is considerably less appealing than a slightly barnyard-scented living room. The flat roofs, meanwhile, earn their keep in every season. In summer, they're used for drying grain, herbs and dung fuel for the coming winter. In the depths of the cold months, they become the rare patch of open, sun-exposed space where laundry might get hung, or where someone bundled in every layer they own steps out briefly for fresh air and a look at the mountains before retreating gratefully back inside. Stacked closely together, house against hillside, an entire village becomes a kind of continuous, textured extension of the landscape itself, stone and mud and rock all blurring into one another until it's genuinely difficult to tell, from a distance, where the mountain ends and the architecture begins. Let's return, briefly and unavoidably, to the subject of dung, because keeping a household stocked with fuel for winter is a genuine, ongoing family project. Dried yak dung is gathered through the warmer months, shaped into flat patties and stacked against outer walls to dry fully in the sun and wind, forming a kind of rustic insulation as well as a fuel reserve. Children are often the ones sent out to collect it, a chore handed down as casually as taking out the trash. Except taking out the trash has never once kept an entire family from freezing. By the time winter arrives, a well-stocked wall of dried dung patties is, quite genuinely, a source of real domestic pride. The technique itself is more involved than it might sound. Fresh dung is gathered, mixed occasionally with a bit of straw or ash to help it bind and burn more evenly, then shaped by hand into flat, even patties before being slapped directly onto a sun-facing wall to dry, or laid out across open ground where the wind and sun can do their work over the following days. Once fully cured, the patties are stacked, often in surprisingly neat, deliberate patterns, forming walls of fuel that double as a visible measure of just how prepared a household is for the season ahead. Ever tried judging a neighbour's preparedness for winter by the tidiness of their firewood stack? Here, the exact same social instinct applies, just with a slightly different raw material. Seasonal timing matters enormously, since dung dries far more effectively during the warmer, drier months than it ever could in the damp cold of winter itself. Families who fall behind on this particular chore during summer and autumn find themselves in real trouble come January, scrambling for scarce fuel during exactly the season when there's least of it lying around to collect. Experienced households build in a comfortable surplus, understanding that a longer, harsher winter than expected is always a real possibility at this altitude, and that running short on fuel isn't a minor inconvenience, it's a genuine emergency. There's an entire etiquette around this chore too, an unspoken sense of whose land, whose grazing routes, and whose herds various families are gathering from, worked out through long-standing custom rather than any formal system. Disputes are rare, mostly because everyone understands, on a very practical level, exactly how much this resource matters to their neighbours as well as themselves. By the time you've spent a season here, you find yourself looking at a neatly stacked wall of dung patties with something approaching genuine admiration, recognising it not as an oddity, but as a small, quietly impressive monument to a family's hard work, foresight, and their reasonable determination not to freeze. It's time to talk about trade, because nomadic herding families and settled farming families need exactly what the other one has. Highland nomads harvest salt from the plateau's mineral-rich lakes, while lowland farmers grow barley and other grain the herders can't easily produce themselves. And for centuries, the two groups have met at seasonal trading points to swap one for the other. Caravans of yaks, loaded with sacks of salt or grain, wind slowly across passes and valleys, following routes memorized rather than mapped, guided by herders who could probably navigate the whole journey blind. It is, in the truest sense, an ancient supply chain, and it has never once needed a single truck. Salt harvesting itself is a striking, almost otherworldly process. Families working at high-altitude salt lakes where mineral-rich water is collected and left to evaporate, leaving behind crusts and crystals of salt that get carefully gathered, dried, and packed for transport. The work is physically demanding and highly seasonal, timed carefully around weather conditions that affect both the evaporation process and the safety of the journey to come. Ever tried to imagine your entire local economy being built around a single, painstakingly harvested mineral, hauled for days across some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet, just so someone in another valley can properly season their tsampa? That's the salt trade in a nutshell, and it's been running smoothly for well over 1,000 years. The caravan journeys connecting salt producers to grain producers were, for centuries, genuinely massive undertakings, sometimes involving hundreds of yaks and multiple families travelling together for safety and efficiency, moving along routes passed down through generations with the kind of detailed, memorized precision that modern travellers now outsource entirely to a phone. These routes crossed some of the highest, most exposed terrain on the plateau, and travellers timed their journeys with real care, watching weather patterns and seasonal shifts, because a caravan caught unprepared in a sudden storm faced genuinely serious danger. What makes this trade so enduring isn't just necessity, though necessity certainly plays its part. It's the deep interdependence it reveals between two very different ways of life sharing the same challenging landscape. The nomadic herder, moving constantly with the seasons, and the settled farmer, tied to fixed fields at lower elevation, need each other in a very direct, practical sense, and that mutual need has, over centuries, built genuine relationships, family connections, and long-standing trading partnerships that stretch back generations. By the time a sack of salt finally reaches a farming household and a sack of grain makes its way back up to a herding family, it represents not just a transaction, but the continuation of a relationship that has quietly, reliably connected these two very different lives across some of the harshest geography on Earth. Let's talk about the marketplace, because very little here changes hands for a fixed price without a proper negotiation first. Salt, wool, butter, dried meat and grain get traded, weighed, argued over, and finally exchanged, often with more theatre than the transaction strictly requires. A good trader knows exactly when to walk away, when to sigh dramatically, and when to accept an offer while still complaining about it just enough to preserve their dignity. Prices shift by season, by scarcity, by how badly winter has treated the herds that year. It is haggling as both economy and entertainment, and by the time a deal is struck, both parties usually leave convinced they got the better end of it. The market itself, when winter allows for one at all, is a genuinely sensory experience. The smell of dried meat and yak butter mixing with wood smoke and cold air, the low murmur of negotiation rising and falling around you, hands gesturing, goods weighed on simple hanging scales, coins and goods alike changing hands amid a steady stream of good-natured complaint. Ever wandered through a flea market back home, confidently lowballed a seller, and felt a small surge of triumph when they agreed almost instantly, only to later suspect you probably could have gone even lower? Multiply that dynamic by several centuries of refined practice, and you've got something close to the real thing. Bartering here isn't considered rude or aggressive. It's simply how business gets done, an expected and even respected part of any transaction. Opening offers are understood by both sides to be starting points rather than serious proposals, and the back and forth that follows is less a conflict and more a kind of practiced social dance, each party testing the other's flexibility, invoking the quality of their goods, the difficulty of the journey that brought them, or the harshness of the season, all in service of landing somewhere both sides can walk away from feeling reasonably satisfied. Weight and quality matter enormously, particularly with salt and grain, and a good trader can assess both with a practiced glance and a quick handful, testing texture, checking for moisture, gauging purity in a way that takes years to develop and roughly 0 seconds to execute once you've got it. Scales, when used, are simple but effective, and disputes over measurement, while not unheard of, are generally settled quickly, since a trader's reputation for honest dealing matters enormously in a world where you'll likely be doing business with these same families at these same seasonal markets for the rest of your life. By the time you finally attempt your own negotiation, badly, over a small bag of dried cheese, and get gently, cheerfully swindled by a trader twice your age with roughly 40 years more practice than you, you'll understand completely that this isn't just commerce. It's a genuine, well-loved local sport, and you have just lost your very first match. It's time to talk about the building that dominates nearly every skyline here, the monastery. Often perched improbably on a cliffside or ridge, as if gravity were more of a polite suggestion than a rule. Monasteries function as spiritual centres, schools, libraries, and community gathering points all at once. Home to monks whose daily rhythm of chanting, study, and ritual continues steadily through even the harshest winter months. Families send sons to train there, sometimes as young children, in an arrangement that blends religious devotion with practical education in a world where formal schools are scarce. The deep, resonant sound of monastery horns carrying across a snow-covered valley is, for many families, simply what time sounds like. Life inside a monastery follows a structure as disciplined and reliable as anything you'd find in the strictest boarding school. Mornings beginning early with chanted prayers, the low, layered hum of many voices reciting texts memorized over years of study, rising and falling in a rhythm that carries clearly through cold mountain air. Days are divided between religious study, ritual practice, and the practical work of simply maintaining a large community through a brutal winter. From tending the monastery's own animals to keeping enormous stores of dried fuel and food properly managed. Ever tried imagining a boarding school where the curriculum includes advanced philosophy, ritual chanting, and also chopping enough dung fuel to heat an entire building complex through 6 months of sub-zero cold. That's a fairly accurate summary of a young monk's winter. The monastery's role extends well beyond its own walls, too. It often serves as the de facto centre of the entire surrounding community, a place families turn to for guidance, ritual observances, education, and even medical knowledge, since many monasteries maintain their own traditions of learning that overlap significantly with local medical practice. Festivals and ceremonies held there draw entire villages, transforming what might otherwise be a quiet, isolated winter into one punctuated by genuine, colourful community gathering. Incense curling into cold air, deep horns and drums echoing off stone walls. Monks in maroon robes moving through elaborate, carefully choreographed rituals that have been performed in nearly identical form for centuries. For families, sending a son to train as a monk carries both spiritual significance and practical weight. A genuine honour for the family, a path to education and literacy that might otherwise be difficult to access, and in households with several children, a meaningful way to manage limited resources across a demanding landscape. The relationship between family and monastery doesn't end there either. Visits, festivals, and ongoing contact keep the bond active, and monasteries frequently serve as a kind of extended, spiritual family for young monks far from home. By the time deep winter fully sets in and the horns sound out again over silent, snow-covered slopes, calling the community to another round of prayer, you begin to understand that this building isn't simply religious architecture. It's the actual, beating heart of the entire valley, keeping time, keeping tradition, and keeping a scattered, hard-working community meaningfully connected through the longest, coldest months of the year. Let's talk about the colours fluttering against all that white, because prayer flags, strung in sequences of blue, white, red, green, and yellow, are everywhere here, carrying blessings and mantras out on the wind toward anyone lucky enough to be downwind. Prayer wheels, cylinders packed with written prayers, get spun by hand as people walk, each rotation understood as another prayer sent quietly out into the world. Elderly villagers in particular can be seen turning small handheld wheels almost constantly, muttering mantras under their breath the way someone else might hum along to a familiar song. It's devotion woven so completely into daily motion that it barely registers as separate from simply walking, working, or waiting. Each colour in the flag sequence carries specific meaning. Blue for open sky, white for clouds and air, red for fire, green for water, and yellow for earth, together representing a kind of complete elemental balance strung along a single line and left to the mercy of the wind. The flags are printed with prayers, mantras, and sacred images, and the belief isn't that the flags themselves are worshipped, but that the wind, moving across the printed text, carries the blessings and goodwill contained within it outward across the surrounding land, benefiting anyone and anything the breeze happens to touch. Ever tried imagining a belief system where the weather itself becomes a willing participant in spreading goodwill? At this altitude, where the wind rarely stops blowing anyway, it's a remarkably practical bit of theology. Prayer wheels operate on a similar underlying principle. Each one, from the smallest handheld version to the large, elaborately decorated wheels, sometimes found at monastery entrances, containing tightly wound scrolls printed with mantras, often thousands of repetitions of the same sacred phrase. A single spin of the wheel is understood as equivalent to reciting every prayer contained within it, turning a simple, repetitive physical motion into an act of accumulated spiritual practice. You watch an elderly man spin his handheld wheel steadily, almost absent-mindedly, while carrying on an entirely unrelated conversation about the weather or the price of barley. And you realize this isn't performative devotion. It's simply background practice, as natural and unremarkable to him as breathing. The sheer physical presence of flags and wheels throughout daily life here is genuinely striking. Strings of flags crossing rooftops, spanning valleys, marking mountain passes and bridges, their colours slowly fading under sun and wind until they're eventually replaced with fresh ones. The old cloth left to disintegrate naturally rather than being removed, since the belief holds that the blessings continue even as the physical flag fades away. Large wheels at monastery entrances, meanwhile, get spun by passing worshippers throughout the day, a steady, rhythmic creak and groan of turning metal becoming part of the ambient soundtrack of the place. By the time you leave, you'll likely find yourself instinctively reaching to spin a wheel you pass, or watching a distant string of prayer flags snap and flutter against a grey winter sky, and understanding, in a way that's hard to fully articulate, exactly why this particular form of quiet, wind-borne devotion has endured here for as long as it has. It's time to talk about the pilgrims, because devotion here doesn't pause for weather, and some of the most committed travel, not by walking, but by prostrating their entire body, again and again, the full length of a journey that might stretch for weeks or months. They rise, step forward, and drop flat to the frozen ground, over and over, wrapped in thick aprons and wooden handguards to survive the repeated impact, covering the same ground you'd cross by simply walking 100 times over. Villagers along the route often offer food, shelter, or a warm fire without being asked, because hosting a pilgrim is understood as its own quiet form of merit. It is, by any modern measure, an extraordinary display of endurance dressed up as ordinary faith. The physical mechanics of this practice are worth appreciating in full, because it's genuinely more involved than it might first appear. A pilgrim stands, brings their palms together at the forehead, throat, and heart in sequence, then lowers themselves fully to the ground, arms extended forward, body flat against snow, rock, or frozen dirt, before rising again and stepping forward to exactly where their fingertips reached, repeating the entire sequence from there. Every single body length of ground gets covered this way, which means a journey that might take you an afternoon on foot can take a devoted pilgrim weeks, sustained by little more than sampa, butter tea, and an evidently formidable reserve of willpower. Ever complained about a long commute involving a delayed train and a crowded platform? Somewhere on this plateau, someone is covering the same distance, one full body prostration at a time, in the snow, and not complaining once. The protective gear pilgrims wear reflects centuries of practical refinement. Thick wooden blocks or padded gloves strapped to the hands to protect them from the repeated impact against rough or frozen ground. Heavy leather or fabric aprons worn over the front of the body to prevent the robes underneath from being shredded within the first few days. Even with this protection, the physical toll is real and considerable, and pilgrims often travel in small groups, supporting one another, sharing food and shelter, occasionally trading off carrying a small cart of supplies that trails along behind the group as they slowly, deliberately make their way toward a sacred destination. What strikes most outsiders isn't just the physical endurance involved, remarkable as it is, but the calm, matter-of-fact attitude pilgrims themselves tend to bring to the whole undertaking.
There's little visible suffering performed for an audience, no dramatic display, just a steady, patient, repetitive rhythm carried out with the same unhurried consistency you'd see in someone simply going about an ordinary daily chore. Villagers along established pilgrimage routes have, over generations, built an entire informal support system around this practice, offering warm meals, a floor to sleep on, or simply directions and encouragement, understanding implicitly that today's exhausted, wind-burned pilgrim might well be tomorrow's host to someone else on their own long, cold, remarkable journey. Let's talk about the one occasion that reliably breaks the quiet rhythm of winter. Losar, the Tibetan New Year, arriving on the lunar calendar sometime in the depths of the cold season. Houses get scrubbed top to bottom, special foods are prepared days in advance, and families dress in their finest layered wool and jewellery, however modest, for visits, feasting, and rituals meant to sweep away the old year's misfortune. Elaborately decorated pastries, dried fruits, and generous pours of chang, a home-brewed barley beer, appear on every table that can afford them. For a few bright, noisy days in the middle of an otherwise silent winter, the whole valley seems to remember, all at once, how to celebrate. Preparations begin well before the day itself, with a thorough house cleaning meant to sweep out not just accumulated winter grime, but any lingering bad luck from the year that's ending, a practice that will feel deeply familiar to anyone who's ever done a frantic pre-guest cleanup. Except here the guest is arguably good fortune itself, and disappointing it carries considerably higher stakes than a judgmental relative noticing dust on the mantel. On the eve of the new year, many households prepare a special noodle soup, its ingredients often carrying small, hidden symbols meant to humorously reveal something about the person who finds them, a playful bit of fortune-telling folded quite literally into dinner. The celebration itself unfolds over several days, each with its own particular focus. The first typically centered on family, quiet rituals, and the very first food and drink of the new year, often taken directly from a carefully prepared, decorative offering set aside the night before. Later days open up into broader community celebration, visits between households, exchanges of kata scarves and small gifts, and no shortage of chang, poured freely and often, warming both hands and spirits against the persistent cold outside. Ever tried to imagine your entire extended social circle rotating through each other's homes for days on end, eating elaborately decorated pastries and being handed drink after drink whether you asked for it or not? Losar makes your average holiday office party look positively restrained by comparison. Symbolism runs through nearly every element of the celebration. specially prepared foods, decorative arrangements, and ritual actions, all carrying meaning related to prosperity, health, and good fortune for the year ahead. Elaborate barley flower sculptures, colourful and carefully shaped, sit alongside dried fruits and other delicacies saved specifically for this occasion. Foods that would rarely appear on an ordinary winter table, making their one grand annual appearance. Monasteries hold their own elaborate ceremonies during this period as well, with masked ritual dances, deep, resonant horns, and clouds of incense drawing crowds from across the surrounding area. By the time the celebrations finally wind down and the valley settles back into its familiar winter quiet, there's a genuine, collective sense of having marked something significant together. A bright, noisy pause carved deliberately out of the season's long, patient stillness. It's time to talk about getting sick, because at this altitude, in this cold, it happens often, and the response to it is older and more sophisticated than you might expect. Traditional Tibetan medicine, built on centuries of accumulated knowledge, uses herbal remedies, pulse diagnosis, and dietary adjustment to treat everything from altitude sickness to the common winter cough. Practiced by trained physicians who blend medical training with spiritual understanding. Amchi, as these doctors are known, are consulted with the same seriousness you'd reserve for a specialist back home. Their remedies passed down through careful apprenticeship rather than a pharmacy shelf. It is medicine shaped entirely by its environment, precise, patient, and built for a place where a simple fever can genuinely turn dangerous. A visit to an amchi is a considerably more involved experience than a quick, modern checkup, beginning typically with a careful, extended pulse reading. The physician's fingers pressed against your wrist for a surprisingly long stretch of time, reading subtle variations that, to their trained sense, reveal detailed information about your overall condition. Urine analysis, dietary history, and a detailed conversation about your symptoms, habits, and recent circumstances round out the diagnostic process, building a complete picture before any treatment is ever recommended. Ever sat through a rushed 10-minute doctor's appointment and wished someone would actually take the time to properly understand what's going on with you? An amchi consultation is, in many ways, the unhurried opposite of that entire modern experience. Treatments draw heavily on an extensive pharmacy of herbal and mineral remedies, carefully prepared and combined according to formulas refined over centuries, alongside dietary guidance and lifestyle adjustments, tailored specifically to the patient and season. Certain herbs, gathered at specific times of year from specific altitudes, are prized for their particular properties, and a skilled amchi's knowledge of which plant, prepared which way, treats which imbalance, represents a genuinely deep, specialized body of expertise, developed and passed down over an extraordinarily long period of careful observation and practice. The underlying framework of this medical tradition views health as a matter of balance among bodily elements, between body and environment, and even between physical and spiritual well-being. A holistic approach that treats the whole person rather than isolating a single symptom. This becomes especially relevant during the harsh winter months, when altitude sickness, frostbite, and respiratory illness are genuine, recurring concerns.
and an Amchi's guidance on prevention, proper layering, diet, and pacing yourself against the thin air carries real, practical weight. By the time you've spent a season here, watching a trusted local physician carefully read a neighbour's pulse by firelight, while outside the wind howls against thick stone walls, you come to appreciate this tradition not as some quaint historical curiosity, but as a genuinely sophisticated system of care, built patiently over centuries by people who understood their harsh environment better than almost anyone else ever could. Let's talk about the passes, because crossing one in winter is never treated casually, no matter how many times someone has done it before. Snow blindness, avalanches, and sudden storms that erase visibility within minutes are all real, well-known dangers. And travellers read the sky, the wind, and the colour of the clouds with the same close attention you might give a weather app. Except getting it wrong here has considerably higher stakes. Experienced guides time their crossings for early morning, before the sun softens the snow into something treacherous underfoot. A pass that looks entirely peaceful at dawn can, by early afternoon, become something else entirely. And everyone here knows better than to find that out the hard way. Snow blindness alone is a real and surprisingly common hazard. Sunlight reflecting off vast, unbroken fields of snow at high altitude, carrying enough ultraviolet intensity to genuinely damage unprotected eyes within a matter of hours. Travellers guard against it with simple but remarkably effective tools: strips of leather, wood, or woven material worn across the eyes with narrow slits cut in, functioning much like a primitive pair of sunglasses, reducing glare while still allowing enough vision to navigate safely. Ever forgotten your sunglasses on a bright, snowy ski trip and spent the rest of the day squinting miserably? Now imagine that same mistake, except the consequences last considerably longer, and the nearest place to buy a replacement pair is several days' walk away. Avalanche risk shapes route planning in ways that require real, accumulated local knowledge. Experienced travellers reading subtle signs in the snowpack, recent weather patterns, and the specific geography of a given slope to judge which routes are relatively safe and which ones simply aren't worth the risk that particular day, regardless of how much time it might cost to go around instead. This knowledge, refined over generations and shared carefully within herding and trading communities, functions as a kind of oral, constantly updated safety manual, one that has kept countless travellers alive precisely because it's taken seriously, without exception, every single time. Weather itself remains the single most unpredictable and genuinely dangerous variable. A clear morning sky offering no guarantee whatsoever about conditions by midday. Storms capable of rolling in with startling speed and cutting visibility down to almost nothing within minutes. Experienced travellers build real margin into their plans, starting early, moving efficiently, and maintaining a constant, practiced awareness of shifting conditions, rather than simply trusting that the calm they started with will hold. By the time you've made your own nervous, careful crossing of a high pass, heart pounding slightly harder than the altitude alone can fully explain, watching your breath cloud in front of you against an impossibly vast, silent, white landscape, you'll understand completely why every single person who crosses that same pass regularly treats it, every single time, with the same careful, unshakable respect. It's time to talk about the evenings, because once the animals are settled and the last chores are done, Winter nights here stretch on for a very long time, and someone has to fill them. Families gather close around the stove, and an elder, often a grandparent, takes up the familiar role of storyteller, recounting folk tales, local legends, and family history that has been passed down through generations without ever once being written down. Children listen wide-eyed, half from genuine fascination and half from the simple fact that there's nowhere else to be. It is entertainment, education, and cultural memory all delivered in a single warm voice, long before anyone here had heard of a television, let alone a phone. The stories themselves cover remarkable ground. Tales of clever animals outwitting more powerful adversaries, legendary heroes and local spirits tied to specific mountains or lakes. Cautionary tales meant, quite transparently, to keep children from wandering too close to dangerous terrain, and family histories that stretch back further than any single person present could ever verify, yet get repeated with complete, unwavering conviction anyway. Ever sat around a fire on a family camping trip, listening to a grandparent tell the exact same story you've heard a dozen times before, and found yourself genuinely absorbed anyway? That instinct, it turns out, is not a modern quirk at all. It's a genuinely ancient one. And this particular household has simply been perfecting it for considerably longer than yours has. The storyteller's role carries real weight within the household, a position that requires not just a good memory, but a real sense of timing, drama, and audience, knowing exactly when to draw out a pause for effect or speed toward a satisfying conclusion before the youngest listeners finally lose the battle against sleep. These sessions serve a genuinely practical function too, beyond simple entertainment, transmitting practical knowledge about the landscape, local history, moral lessons, and cultural values in a form that sticks far more effectively than any lecture ever could. A story about a foolish traveller who ignored warning signs before a storm carries real, memorable weight for a child who will, in a few years, need to make exactly those same judgment calls themselves. The physical setting matters as much as the stories themselves. The low orange glow of the stove, casting long shadows against stone or mud walls, the smell of wood smoke, or rather dung smoke, settling comfortably into the room, the gathered warmth of an entire family pressed close together against the cold pressing in from every direction outside. By the time the youngest children have finally drifted off mid-story, and the elder's voice drops to little more than a low, steady murmur for the benefit of whoever's still listening, you understand that this nightly ritual isn't simply a way of passing time. It's how an entire culture, without a single written record, has managed to carry its history, its humour, and its hard-earned wisdom faithfully forward, one long, dark winter evening at a time. Let's talk about romance, because even at 4,000 meters, in the dead of winter, people are still falling in love and finding creative ways to prove it. Courtship customs vary widely across the plateau's different communities, but gift-giving, particularly the offering of a ceremonial white scarf called a kata, plays a central role in formal proposals and blessings alike. Weddings themselves are often timed around the quieter winter months, when herding duties ease off and families finally have the time to host proper celebrations. Matches are frequently arranged with careful input from both families, though genuine affection, once established, is taken every bit as seriously as the negotiations that preceded it. The kata itself is a deceptively simple object, a length of white silk or cotton, offered with both hands and a slight bow. carrying meanings far beyond its plain appearance: respect, good wishes, and sincerity, appropriate for greeting an honored guest, blessing a new venture, or, in matters of the heart, formally signaling a proposal or the sealing of an agreement between families. Ever tried to imagine proposing marriage with nothing more than a piece of white fabric and a great deal of sincerity? It sounds almost too simple until you realize how much genuine meaning an entire culture has managed to fold into a single, carefully offered gesture. Marriage negotiations frequently involve considerably more than the couple themselves. Extended families discussing practical matters like herd size, household resources, and the compatibility of families as much as the compatibility of the two people actually getting married, a process that might sound coldly transactional until you consider that in a place where survival genuinely depends on cooperation and shared resources, this kind of careful, practical matchmaking has kept households functioning and thriving for generations. That said, genuine courtship and affection are hardly absent from the process, and stories of persistent, determined suitors, clever gestures, and long, patient winters spent proving one's worth to a prospective family are a well-loved thread running through local storytelling traditions. Winter weddings, once the timing and families are settled, become genuinely festive occasions. Entire communities gathering for feasting, music, and ceremony despite the cold, guests arriving bundled in their finest layered wool, chang poured freely, songs and blessings offered by elders on behalf of the newly joined families. The bride's transition to her new household, in many traditions, carries its own set of rituals and symbolic gestures, each carefully observed step meant to bless the union and ease what is, in practical terms, a genuinely significant life change happening in the middle of the harshest season of the year. By the time you've watched an entire village turn out, bundled in wool, breath fogging in the cold, singing and celebrating late into a winter night on behalf of two people just beginning their life together, you understand that even here, at the very edge of what a human body can comfortably endure, love finds a way to make itself thoroughly, stubbornly, wonderfully inconvenient in exactly the way it always has everywhere else. Let's turn, gently and respectfully, to the way death is met here, because it looks nothing like what you may be used to, and it deserves to be understood on its own terms rather than judged against a different tradition. In many Tibetan Buddhist communities, the body is offered, following specific rituals guided by monks, to the elements and to birds of prey, a practice known as sky burial, rooted in beliefs about impermanence, the cycle of rebirth, and the practical reality of frozen, rocky ground that makes burial difficult across much of the plateau. It is not treated as grim or morbid by those who practice it, but as a final act of generosity, the body's last gift returned quietly to the natural world it came from. The practice is deeply connected to core Buddhist teachings about impermanence, the belief that the body, once life has left it, is simply an empty vessel, and that the spirit or consciousness has already moved on toward its next stage. Rather than preserving or elaborately marking the physical remains, the tradition emphasizes release, the body given back openly to nature, sustaining other life in its final act. Monks perform specific rituals and prayers throughout the process, guiding the family and community through what is understood as a meaningful, spiritually significant transition rather than simply an ending. There are also genuine practical dimensions woven into this tradition. Across much of the high plateau, the ground stays frozen and rocky for much of the year, making conventional burial extremely difficult, while wood, scarce and precious as it already is for daily fuel needs, is far too valuable a resource to devote to cremation on any regular basis. Sky burial, in this light, reflects the same deep, practical resourcefulness that shapes so much of daily life here, a community finding a respectful, sustainable way to honour its dead within the genuine constraints of an unforgiving landscape. Families approach this practice with the same solemn seriousness any culture brings to honouring its dead, grief handled with quiet dignity, community support extended generously to those left behind, and the entire process wrapped carefully in ritual, prayer, and meaning that has been refined and passed down across many generations. It asks something different of an outside observer than a Western funeral might, but it deserves to be understood as exactly what it is: a coherent, deeply meaningful spiritual practice shaped by genuine belief and genuine environmental necessity together, carried out with real care and real reverence by people honouring their loved ones in the way their culture has taught them is right. Let's step back for a moment and look at the whole shape of this season, because winter here asks something different of people than it does almost anywhere else on Earth.
It asks for patience with thin air, closeness with family, respect for animals that make survival possible, and a kind of quiet endurance that never announces itself as heroic, because to the people living it, it's simply Tuesday. There is real hardship in it: frozen water, breathless mornings, danger on every pass. And there is real warmth too. Tea shared, stories told, celebrations timed carefully around the darkest days. Somehow, at the roof of the world, both of those things turn out to be completely, unremarkably true at once. You think back, now, over everything this single winter has asked of you. The frozen streams you chopped through with numb hands, the bowls of butter tea you eventually, genuinely came to crave, the 9 layers of wool you have not once fully removed, the ceiling-close silence of a house shared with 3 generations, several yaks, and no privacy whatsoever. None of it, taken individually, sounds particularly restful. And yet, somehow, taken together, it forms a life that runs with a rhythm and a resilience that puts most modern comforts quietly to shame. There's a lesson in that, tucked somewhere between the smoke of the stove and the creak of a spinning prayer wheel, about how much a person, a family, an entire community can genuinely endure, adapt to, and even find real joy within, given enough time, enough shared effort, and enough stubborn, practical ingenuity. Ever complained about your thermostat being set 1 degree too low? Somewhere at 4,000 meters, a family is warming an entire home with fuel their own animals produced yesterday, and they are, by any reasonable measure, doing just fine. And that, more than the cold, more than the thin air, more than any single hardship, might be the truest thing this whole winter has to teach. Life at the roof of the world was never simply about surviving the altitude. It was about building, patiently and deliberately, an entire, rich, warm, deeply human existence directly on top of conditions that seem, from the outside, almost designed to make that impossible.
Somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they managed it anyway. And they've been managing it for a very long time. So there you have it. A whole season lived at the edge of what a body should reasonably be asked to tolerate, and somehow, against every sensible expectation, thriving there anyway. You chop through ice for water that anywhere else would simply come out of a tap. You wore 9 layers of wool and still counted yourself lucky. You drank tea that tasted like a decision at first and like comfort by the end of the week. You slept shoulder to shoulder with 3 generations of a family that wasn't yours, and somehow it felt less crowded than lonely. There is something worth carrying with you from a place like this, long after the fire has gone quiet and the prayer flags have faded into the wind. The people who call this plateau home never had the luxury of complaining their way out of winter. They simply built a life sturdy enough to hold it. 1 stove, 1 bowl of butter tea, 1 carefully told story at a time. And somehow, in the middle of all that hardship, they still found room for celebration, for courtship, for laughter passed around a fire that barely kept the cold at bay. So tonight, as you sink into your own soft bed, with your own working heat and your own plumbing that asks nothing of you but a turned handle, maybe spare a quiet thought for the families still up there right now, 4,000 meters closer to the stars than you are, doing exactly what they've always done. Because travel, even the imagined kind, has a way of reminding you that comfort is not something to take lightly, and that somewhere, right now, someone is proving all over again just how resourceful, how patient, and how quietly remarkable people can be. Sleep well. You've earned your easy breathing tonight.